not about truth and telling white folk the truth of African history, the truth of our contributions to America, the truth of our great ancient past. For these people are not going to give up their privileges and wealth and power merely because they learned that you are Egyptians, or because you've contributed to American wealth, or these other things. It's too addictive for that. They will say, so what? Good for you. We are still holding on to what we got. And if you get in the way of what we got, we will crush you, Egyptian past or not. So the idea then that you're going to have a truth crusade that will rescue you from the subordination to white power is an illusion, and one you should rapidly get over. We're dealing here then, as I mentioned, with the uselessness of the African male and the fact that this system no longer has a place for the African male except for prison. And this, of course, is demonstrated by the fact that this white legislature is willing to pass a bill that spends $22 billion to build 10 additional federal prisons and to contribute to the building of prisons in states. It is willing to add 47 to 52 new laws that require the death penalty. It adds on to its many statutes a requirement that states treat 13-year-old black males and 13-year-olds as adults, and that they lay on them mandatory sentences so that they can spend lifetimes in prisons. They have lowered the treatment, the age of treatment, so that in a sense they can literally pick up young men out on the street in their, not hardly even into their teens, and lock them in the jails for the rest of their lives. So the issue here then is not an issue of whether black boys need to be trained into jobs and so forth. The issue is that the American economy is being transformed in such a way that there are few, if any, jobs for black men. It means, ladies and gentlemen, that the African American community must become a creator of jobs for its own people. Sidney Wilhelm said in the book, a seminal book which you cannot find, but an excellent book, Who Needs the Negro, written back in 1967, a classic book. The Negro becomes a victim of neglect as he becomes useless to an emerging economy of automation. With the onset of automation, the Negro moves out of his historical state of oppression into one of uselessness. We don't have time to talk about that phrase, you see. But America will become less overtly racist to the point where we become less useful to it. In other words, we're not going to block you from having freedom to do things, but the deal is you won't have money to do it. And so, you know, we're going to create fair everything, except the situation is you won't be in a position to take advantage of it. So the issue then won't be so much our oppression and overt racist oppression, but our absolute uselessness in an automated society, in a global economic system. In fact, the issue now has moved to a degree beyond racism, to a degree having to deal with the economic structuring of the world and of the society. He goes on to say, increasingly, he is not so much economically exploited as he is irrelevant. The tremendous historical change is taking place in these terms. He is not needed. He is not so much oppressed as unwanted, not so much unwanted as unnecessary, not so much abused as ignored. The dominant whites no longer need to exploit the black minority. As automation proceeds, it will be easier for the former to disregard the latter. In short, white America, by a more perfect application of mechanization and a vigorous reliance upon automation, disposes of the Negro. Consequently, the Negro transforms from an exploited labor force into an outcast. The Negro's anguish does not rise only out of brutalities of past oppression. The anxiety stems more than ever before out of being discarded as a waste product of technological production. This is the world that we are facing. And therefore, being caught up in terms of racism is an obsolete fact. It is time now to deal with the economic and social realities of the world. We got Negroes here who were duped into a whole generation of stupid struggle. We have Jesse Jackson out here claiming to be speaking in terms of violence. We got an old leadership group of people here who are principally responsible for the violence that is occurring in the black community, pretending to be dealing with it. For it was their decisions made in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, and the 70s that created the kind of community that our youngsters must contend with today. Our youth did not make these neighborhoods. Our youth are not making the world that they live in, and yet we spend a great deal of time analyzing them and their music without analyzing ourselves as adults and looking at the decisions we made in the 60s and 70s that place our youth in the kind of situation they face today. And we cannot say that we were not warned. As a matter of fact, W.E.B. Du Bois warned the NAACP as far back as 1934 when he told them that blacks would be segregated for decade upon decade, and therefore the NAACP needs to promulgate an economic program for African people in terms of where they were in the American culture. And if African American people were segregated in the American culture, then African American people needed to develop an economic system based on their segregated reality. He was thrown out of the NAACP for that reason. And he told them then in 1934 that African people would be segregated for decade upon decade. Why not establish an educational program that spoke to the needs of the people where they were? He was seen as a latter-day Booker T. Washington for saying so, and was thrown out. Booker T. Washington himself, at the turn of the century, was warning of the same thing. You need to get economic power. You need to gain control of your internal markets. You need to establish your economic stability. Deal with the votes later. This is what other immigrant groups do. No, the NAACP struggled, called him an Uncle Tom, derided this man, and now what do we have? We have the right to vote while we are homeless. We have the right to vote while we are jobless. We have the right to vote while our children are miseducated. This right that we were told would bring us a cornucopia of blessings and freedoms. We have the right to ride the front of the bus, and we're the only one riding on it. Yes. We have a right to sit at the lunch counter with white folk and we ain't got no money to buy a sandwich. We got all of these abstract rights, but nothing real. And this is the situation we face. We inhabit neighborhoods where the industries have flown away and left us bereft of jobs and opportunity. Why? Because we have not paid attention to the realities of our lives. And now we are overrun with violence, because violence is the result of social disorganization. Violence is the result of a nation not being able to feed and clothe its people legitimately. I think Ellis was the one, and his group indicated that when you looked at the number of black inmates in the prisons of New York, you would see that 75% of them came from essentially 7 neighborhoods in the whole state. And when you look at those neighborhoods of Brownsville and Harlem and South Jamaica, South Bronx, These areas, you will see that those are areas that have high indicators of other social problems. Joblessness, unemployment as we call it, low levels of education, high levels of infant mortality, a low percentage of native people in those areas that own and control the internal markets. In other words, there's a very direct relationship between the economic organization, between the educational organization and institutional organization of those communities, and the violence that is a part of those communities and characterize those communities. A very direct relationship. And yet when they were told in the 50s and the 60s that the economies of these communities should fall into the hands of African people and be developed by African people, they were told that we were engaged in self-segregation, that we would all live in suburbs with white folk. We'd all be a part of the Fortune 500. Our children would all be bused to learn that 2 plus 2 is 4 in Scarsdale and White Plains, as if 2 plus 2 is not 4 in Harlem. And yet we find ourselves overrun with violence here today. In other words, then, what we have recognized is that the major struggle in America is not the struggle for political democracy, but for economic democracy. For you can have political democracy. You can vote if you want to, but you can still be poverty-stricken. You can vote if you want to, but you will still have no power. As Robert Allen in his book, when he talks about, the Black Awakening in Capitalist America, he makes this statement that too many of us still believe that democracy works the way it is described in school textbooks. That is, that political power is based on the will of a majority of the people in a given geographical area. He goes on to say, but political power in America is dependent on those who control valued resources and critical institutions, not vice versa. And those who have this power cannot be voted out of their positions by the public at large, because the base of their power lies outside of the formal political sphere. Their base of power lies in the corporations and the large public institutions, which are interdependent but largely removed from the sway of public pressure. What did I just get through saying? The people that will run the global economic system and control the politics of America are not people who run for office. The heads of multinational corporate systems don't run for office. You don't vote on their election to their offices. Yet it is those very people who determine the political and economic destiny of people. And yet you got a group of people, even on the radio station you revere so much, that tell you voting is your key to power. Voting is not a key to power. And we got a joker in South Africa who's running the same game on the South African people, who's going to run a game on African American people, claiming that they got a multi-ethnic, multicultural society, who are going to probably mix their diplomatic missions with blacks and coloreds and Afrikaner whites so that they can impress on the world that they have achieved diversity in the world. When the ownership of production and the ownership of land and wealth will remain as much in the hands of whites as it has ever remained. And you will think because you have elected a Nelson Mandela to be the president that you represent the taking over of South Africa by black people. If you believe that, you believe in the tooth fairy. You have never seen any multicultural, multi-ethnic nation rise to the top in the struggles of the world. You've only seen ethnic nations and nations based on ethnicity. But you want to fall asleep to some swan song And Nelson Mandela should know better. He has the whole history of Africa before him, when other African jokers told their people that if they controlled the legislatures of their nations, and if they elected the heads of their government, that meant that they were free and in control of their nations. And yet today, as I told you earlier, Africa is frozen out of economic development with its African heads of nations and its African legislatures. Why? Because they did not see the first things first. And the first thing in a revolutionary change is that the revolutionary people take control of their lands and their wealth, or otherwise they have no real power. And power in America is not the power of the vote, but the power of the ownership of resources and the ownership of labor and control of labor. For when you own these things, you can buy the votes, and you can buy the elected officials voted into office by the people. You want a true example? If you read a few months ago, you would have seen your great Major Owens and your great Jenkins from New Jersey and some other black politicians of the Black Caucus being wined and dined in South Korea, having to meet the presidents of South Korea, meeting the president of the largest corporations over there, attending seminars on race harmony. What's going on here, ladies and gentlemen? These people whose trips were sponsored by a Korean pastor who pastors a black congregation in Nyack, New York, sponsored by the Koreans in America. What do you think is going on? You think because you voted for these people, they are going to see about your interests when another people is whining and dining them and toasting them and contributing to their campaigns and so forth? If you do, you're out of your mind. But this is the way politics is played, not by voting. You're deceived by a bourgeois class that is wedded to the Democratic Party, that has got the few crumbs that it has from being attached to the Democratic Party. That's why it cannot create an independent black party. You got the owners of your radio stations and other stations preaching to you about voting day in and day out. Why? Because they gained their privileges because they were voted into office by black people and used their being voted into office to parlay into the ownership of a bit of property. And therefore they want black people in America to believe that electing them to office represents the path of freedom for the masses of the people. And consequently then, they educate you about voting, but do not educate you about the reality of power in America. They make you think then that their power represents the power of the people. These lessons are too clear, but people who don't read, people who do not know the power of the word, will have all of this information right in front of them and perish. And we'll end it here soon. Yes, we're going to talk a little bit then about what's going on. In other words, the key struggle in America is the struggle for economic democracy. That means African people must come to own large and substantial portions of America. Not just moms and pop stores in Harlem, but we must, if these corporations are going to so-called rule the world, then we must be an intricate part and an integral part of these corporations. We either must be a part of their ownership or we must destroy them, one way or the other. When and how these corporations decide to move the world in terms of their interest, then African people must be a part of that decision-making process. And that means then the ownership of production in America, the ownership of production in Africa, the ownership of production in other parts of the world must belong to a good extent with African people. So we're talking about a broad and grand economic program here, because it is only through this kind of program that we can salvage our very lives as a people. To do this, though, ladies and gentlemen, you have to think of yourself as a nation. One of the reasons why we do not analyze our problems correctly is because we do not analyze them with the concept of nation. If you analyze problems in terms of individualism, you're in trouble. If you analyze problems in terms of family background, you're going to miss the whole point. If I hear this statement, we must return to traditional values, one more time I shall puke. What traditional values? This is not traditional America. Do you realize the transformation that has happened to America in the last 20 to 30 years? Do you recognize that values have to have some compatible relationship to the economic reality in which a people exist? And you're talking about recalling some primitive values in a whole nother world? What do white people mean by traditional values anyway? What are values? You think values are merely those things that determine what is right and what is wrong, what ought to be and what should be? Recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that values are instruments of social control. That's the chief basis for values. That is, what values you honor are those values that determine how you behave. Where your values are, there is your money. Where your values are, there is your attention. Where your values are, there is oriented your behavior. And therefore, values are determiners of how people will behave, how they think, how they see the world and relate one to the other. They're not just right and wrong. They're not just about personal salvation. They're not just about getting into heaven or staying out of hell. Values, you should ask, values for whom? Values for whose benefit? These are the questions. Who is teaching me these values that they say I should honor? And in what way do these values, if I practice them, will benefit them? And in what way would they work for me or against my interests? It's not just a matter of going to heaven or hell. There are black people who think then that they can separate moral behavior from economic behavior. When you choose to behave morally, you also make an economic choice. If you belong to a moral system that says you should wear all white all day and nothing else, the people who are into selling colored shirts are in trouble. That means that your very moral decision determines a market. But those people who sold the white uniforms are into it. In other words, then, when your moral system tells you to eat this and don't eat that, then those people who sell what you don't eat have problems. But those who sell you what you say you should eat are into the money. You don't make moral decisions separate from economic decisions. You don't choose values that are separate from everything else that goes on in the society. So when people start talking to you about choosing values, they are talking about a means of socially controlling your behavior. And when whites tell you about traditional family values and traditional American values, they're talking about those kind of values where you say, I'm poor and I'm in need, but I'm too proud to ask for welfare. Yeah. So that way you'll die filled with values. And the American public, which has robbed you in the first place, won't have to pay a nickel for you. Yeah, that's what traditional values are. Traditional values tell you that you can let another people starve you and cut off your lifeline, take total control of your economic system, but you're such a law-abiding citizen. You won't take control of your own wealth and you'll starve to death because you're a good Negro. The major reason why Africa, America is in the trouble it is today is because of good, law-abiding, church-going Negroes. Yes. Who do not realize that there's no such thing as a sacred law, but a game that's run on the people who make the law as a means of manipulating and robbing from other people. That's what it's about. So when you become law-abiding, you agree to the rules of the game. And if the rules of the game mean that those who are in control legitimize their thievery, you will go along with their theft of your very life and property because you want to claim how law-abiding you are. And someone has told you to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's when Caesar stole it from you in the first place. Someone told you not to see color and not to choose, and that to choose to take care of your own children and to spend money so that your own children can benefit first is reverse racism. So that you feel guilty when you spend with a black person and you feel inflated and morally pure when you give your money to other people. And you feel that you're doing God's will. And yet it goes against the very morality that you should know, that those who receive charity should be those who are in need of it most. And if you looked hard at your own situation, you would recognize that black children and black people are in need of your wealth more than any other people. But somebody's got you thinking that to give your wealth to people who are already rich, to not pay any attention to how you spend your money, is an example of Christian charity and morality. And therefore, following this moral structure, you have created neighborhoods overrun with the kind of problems that we talk about here today. Negroes who talk about that they're individuals and that they're doing their own thing. Isn't that interesting? We talk about individualism, right? That means that we're supposed to be uniquely different. If we're so uniquely different, why do we buy millions and millions of 3-liter bottles of Pepsi Cola? Why do we buy millions of pairs of Timberland shoes? Where are all these individuals who are supposed to have such different tastes and choice? Why do we buy millions and millions of the same types of clothes, the same type of food, the same type of entertainment, the same type of music? What are we talking about? Who are these individuals who have such separate choices that they end up buying over and over again the same product, millions upon millions of the same product, saying they're doing their own thing, and I'm an individual expressing my own taste? You must be joking. You're no individuals. There's no such thing as individualism. It's a joke that the white man runs on you. You say these other people are individuals? Well, tell me this. Why is it that 180 million white individuals decide that they won't spend a nickel with you? If they are so free, and if they are so different, and if they are so unique, and if they do all their things, and if they, then why is it a good chunk of them don't spend money with black people? Where is this individual choice? Where is this individual choice when 7 or 8 million Asians will walk 10 miles around not to put a nickel in your hands, and yet they come and sell you everything they got? Where is this individualism, ladies and gentlemen? Where is this individualism in Detroit when Arabs can own the infrastructure of that city and Negroes spend money after money with them and they not spend a dime and they treat them like dogs? But we are individuals. We are doing our own thing. We are not a monolithic race. I believe in diversity. You're the only one that believes in it too. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we are a de facto nation in America. Black people are the most segregated people on the American continent. We are even segregated in our suburbs. only a small percentage of black people really live in what you call mixed neighborhoods. We are locked in these ghettos. And yet we're pretending that we're some kind of diverse culture. America literally has imprisoned us. And yet, unlike W.E.B. Du Bois or Booker T. Washington, we still hesitate to drop our buckets where we are and to operate as a nation. This country is not a whole country in the sense we think of it as. It is a nation of nations. You have the white American nation. You have the Arab American nation, the Korean American nation. Each of these ethnic groups essentially is a nation to itself. And they relate to each other the way nations relate to each other in the international sense. What do I mean by that? You hear the struggle that goes on between the United States and Japan, where the Japanese take advantage of the free market of America, so-called free market, sell in the American market, but build walls around their own country and block trade from the United States in Japan. Therefore, the Japanese earn tons of money from the United States, expatriates that money, and uses that money to advance its economic growth and to compete with the United States. This is what nations do. This is what nations are about. Clinton went to Seattle a few weeks ago to lick the Chinese ass. For what reason? Because the Chinese and the Southeast Asians are literally locking them out of their markets. And they're trying to find ways to break into the markets. We have a region here that within maybe 15 to 20 years will be the primary region in the world and have the largest market in the world, whose purchasing power will surpass that of Japan within the next 10 years, and whose economic dominance will be larger than that of the United States and Europe. And this is what the white boys are dealing with over there. And these people do not even need white money to advance their interests. Little Taiwan sits there with $215 million of investable money. Hong Kong sits there with $235 billion of investable money. You can go to Indonesia with 46 billion. You can look at Thailand with something like 30 billion. You're looking at a region with some 800 billions of dollars that it can invest in its economic growth and development. You can look at the Chinese economy, which today is the third largest economy, and is predicted by the Wall Street Journal will, by 2015, if this country does not derail it or steal from it, will be the largest economy in the world, growing at 12% today. This is what you're dealing with here. These are nations. And how do they do what they do? We're going to come back to that in a minute. But they operate as nations. That means that they try to take as much advantage of other people's market philosophies and the structure of other people's markets while doing what? Protecting their own. This is the way nations do it. When you then look at the Koreans or others in this country, you will see that they practice exactly the same political economy as does Japan. Which means what? That they take advantage of the free and open market of the African American nation, sell in that nation, create wealth in that nation's markets, export that wealth to their own, and block any access to their own markets by African Americans. And use then that exported wealth to continue to invest in the African American community, but ultimately to invest in the large American economy and to invest into the national and international economy and to fund the growth and development of their own native nations. This means then that African Americans have a political and economic ideology. You see, if we looked at ourselves as a nation, we would see that we have, as a nation, a political and economic strategy and an ideology. And we've had it over historical time. We believe in open markets. free markets, right? Yeah, we believe in that mythology because this is what we were taught in Economics 101. The greatest lies told in America are the lies around economics. Yes. We believe in being fair, so we're going to be an example to other people. What does that mean then? That we're going to open our markets and not prohibit them to enter our markets based on race or any other thing. See, that's reverse racism. We believe that people should be free to invest anywhere they feel like investing without regard to race, color, or creed. This is what they teach Negroes, despite the fact that this is not how the world operates in reality. This is the ideology of black folk. And this ideology then permits other nations and people to invade the African American markets and take advantage of those markets. But they don't have that belief in regard to their own. They believe that they should be in control of their markets. They believe that they should not leave it open for everyone else to come in. Therefore, what happens? They gain access to the African American market, and they retain access to their own market. And not only that, they block African American entrepreneurs from access to their own people. And now we're wondering why we're suffering the way we do. But it's because we as a nation have a self-defeating economic ideology. Because we believe Horatio Alger myths that people come in and they wash dishes for 20 years and save up their little money. And then they get a little store. And from that, they build a chain of stores. Now, this is kind of economic philosophy we've been taught. We've been taught that this is a free market where money talks and bullshit walks. Nonsense. America has never had a free market. It has never had an open market. Never. Black people have never been a part of an open market or a free market or a market system. A free market or an open market would be a market where trade and exchange takes place purely on the basis of value, where the buyer trades and with the seller purely on the basis of price and worth of those things that are being traded. Nothing else is taken into consideration. In other words, in a free and pure market economy, you have an impersonality. Only money talks. But as soon as someone decides to sell or not sell because you are a different color, or raise the price because you're a different color, or deny loans because you're a different color, or deny access to the market and so forth, you're not in a market economy. You're not in a free market at all. And you've never been in one. And yet, you want to project your own market ideology as one of free and open market, where you permit other people free access. You must understand that the white man rules and orders this society in terms of the economic system. It is by means of control of the economic system that he has that he creates class and racial differences, and that he disciplines the whole nation in terms of firing or not firing, in terms of wage and salary differentials, in terms of lending or not lending, in terms of